there, dear friends, and thank you for that warm welcome. Always appreciated, you know. Now, we have a little surprise for you, because today we have Scott Henderson and Marcus Allen stopping by. Yay! Yay! Oh, a lot of other stuff there now, eh? Now, what they're going to be doing is they're going to be showing you just how fake Apollo was. Just like I've been saying all these years now, that Apollo was fake, and there's no question about it now, is it there, friends, eh? Not only that, but they're going to show you all kinds of goodies that were left on the moon. So that's why this is called Aliens on the Moon Part 2. So you're going to see all kinds of things there, friends. You're going to find spark plugs, you're going to find beer cans, and you're going to find all kind of stuff there. But that beer can, oh boy, oh boy, oh boy, that beer can's got to be one of the funniest things I've ever seen in a long time. Oh, my dear God, a beer can. Oh, what next now, eh? So, let's get on with the film, and to top that all off there, we'll just introduce here Marcus Allen and Scott Henderson! Yay!
You've been researching this for years.
The thing is when you're researching something like this, and you're listening to NASA and their other representatives, they try to discourage you from looking further into the subject. They're trying to blind you with science. They try to tell you that you're not smart enough to understand it. And I find that quite disturbing that they would do something like that. Like when the initial people were coming up with this, the original researchers, it's pretty amazing what they were doing because they were working alone. There was no communication like you had today. You were taking their own personal knowledge, like Marcus Allen, his knowledge of the cameras. He looked at the story that NASA is saying, and they're going, how did these things work? How do they work in that environment? So then he researches to see the modifications they made, and the modifications were quite simply to allow them to operate the cameras with the suits, so they could clip them on the front of the suits. They put a trigger on it so they could use it with the gloves, but there was no modifications made for the environment. And of course, when he asked them, they won't respond.
Go figure.
They simply won't give them the answer. They actually did respond because they initially took the information and made it disappear. They say, oh, we lost it. So for years, they're saying we lost it. Even Ron Howard couldn't get any of the videos.
Right.
Well, miraculously, all those videos are back online. You can find them on YouTube. They're just flooding the market with it now. And like I said, they're trying to just blind you with science. They're trying to just overload everything. They put 10,000 pieces on Flickr of photos out there. And they say, here's the puzzle, you put it together. Well, I put it together. It doesn't state what they say it is. It is a little more defined. It's more like what Gus Grissom wanted to say. And the astronauts that documented that, right? They lost 3 of their friends. They couldn't go to the media. They couldn't do it in front of the camera. But when they got behind the camera, they started to document everything. And of course, nobody could really see what they were doing. They couldn't walk out on the set. They couldn't have other footprints out there. These guys were fairly much alone with those cameras. And what they did with those cameras is they showed how the sets were built, where it was located. They showed and documented all of the equipment they were using, carefully documented it through each of the 6 missions. And if you look at it, it's the same equipment. Like if you're going to stage it 6 times, fake it 6 times, you don't need 6 landers. You only need 1 experimental package, and you only need 1 rover. Unless it breaks down, you have to get another one out. And that's exactly what they did. And they documented every bit of it. If you're looking at the photos I sent you, you can see the equipment aging with time. I mean, over 2.5 years, they left it laying outside. It gets rained on, the sun bakes it, and you can see the stuff age. The seismic experiment, which is just a large foil sitting on the ground, I sent you 1 shot, and it's showing that the dirt has caked back after it rained on it, and there's mold around the edge of it. And then the next shot I sent you is the next mission. the stuff is all dried and cracked, the foil splitting back.
But, in your opinion, did we have the technology itself in these rockets, in these vehicles, to even get to the moon?
Just consider the computers, the guidance system on the computer. They're traveling about 400 times faster than a vehicle. We only made 3 adjustments in 238,000 miles. So that computer and the accuracy of the computer would have to be faster than what new Tesla is. Consider the speed it's traveling at and the accuracy when it's only going to make 3 corrections over that period.
Okay.
Like 1 a day. It's only going to make 1 adjustment a day. How accurate does that thing have to be? And they're checking it with a sextant against the stars. Like, it's almost impossible today to do it because you're traveling, you're free from Earth, you're on your own. If you match it to the Earth, you have to calculate the speed it's moving at. If you point it at the moon, you have to estimate where it's going to be and where you are. And then you have to take in the gravitational pull as it declines from the Earth and as it increases to the moon, and then the side pull from the sun. All of those calculations have to be put in there.
And they have to be perfect. They have to be,
perfect.
Like they say, it has to be a perfect blend, a perfect mixture to...
And they only had enough fuel to make 3 adjustments on the way.
But I'm on the fence about this. And what do you think so far, Phil?
Well, one of the first questions I have, and this is going to the very beginning, if they left this stuff sitting out where the elements, the weather got to it and everything, did NASA really think people were so stupid that they wouldn't notice these things eventually? Did they just underestimate the intelligence of the American people?
People weren't supposed to see these 50 years later, 48 years later. They took thousands of photographs. What they used, maybe 3 dozen photos for each mission for media purposes. Even the people that were looking at them would have just quickly shot through and say, oh, we need one of the lander, one of the flag, add a couple of the rover. The rest of them were just there. They would have just been archived. Right? And if they did see them like that, they would have set them aside. They said, we're not going to use that.
If you look at a photograph, you normally just look at it as a 2-dimensional image and you see the images in it. If you examine it technically and you look at the optics that would have been used to create that image, you look at the light levels, the direction of the light, and you look at the focus, because quite often in photographs you'll see photographs that have part of it is out of focus. So that will tell you what type of lens is being used. If you can read a photograph, you can then start to deconstruct it. And once you start to read the photograph, and I've been technically trained as a photographer, I know what cameras can and cannot do. I know what film can record. And I found so many anomalies and unexplained details in these photographs that it makes me wonder if we have been seriously misled. Now, there are many arguments for and against radiation. Some people will say that radiation is not nearly as intense as it's being made out to be. I made the possible mistake of saying that these spacesuits, which are obviously protecting the astronauts because they've been to the moon and they were all still healthy, well, they were at the time, could the same spacesuits be used to go into Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, and now Fukushima and clear up the mess? Because radiation is radiation.
Right.
And the manufacturers of the spacesuit, the International Latex Corporation, said, we don't advise that. There was no radiation protection supplied in the spacesuits. We built them according to the specification that NASA supplied us with. So if the spacesuits couldn't protect the astronauts from radiation, either they did not go where we were told they went, because if they had, they would all have been dead.
Right.
And having a dead astronaut live on television is not exactly what NASA wanted to promote their human space travel.
That's a huge risk.
It was an enormous risk. And it's still, I mean, have you seen pictures of astronauts returning from the International Space Station after 6 months in orbit? They can't stand up. They have to be carried away. They have to be carried out of their craft. Right, they recover. It's to do with muscle wastage. It's to do with microgravity or zero gravity.
And
it affects the human body quite severely.
These are things that NASA doesn't want us to know. And Scott, what's your opinion on the radiation?
Let's assume that we follow NASA's story and say that spacecraft had sufficient radiation protection, and let's say that the space suits had protection. and it only took an hour to go through the Van Allen belts and everything was fine. Well, what happened on the 3 days on the way back is completely different, because they came back into the craft with radioactive dirt all over their suits, got out of them, okay? They're in zero gravity, and this stuff is just floating around inside that craft with all three of them. And on top of that, they put 100 kilos of radioactive rocks in there with them. What do you think happened to them on the way back? I mean, there was no protection then. They're fully exposed to it for 3 solid days on the way back.
Okay, I'm just playing devil's advocate here a little bit. I can't believe that NASA would be that sloppy with things.
Even the shot of the rover sitting there, nice, beautiful close-up shot of the Apollo 17 rover, the rear axle has an oil leak. There's no liquids in space. The mud's stuck all over it.
People like Scott weren't expected, 50 years after it all happened, to spend the hundreds of hours that he has spent looking at these photographs. There was just no concept that somebody would do that. Apollo happened, 60s, early 1970s, as Scott said very accurately. NASA are basically an agency, a part of the Department of Defense. There were many shuttle missions we never heard a thing about because they were launching military satellites. So the idea that you can't keep a secret is complete rubbish. Of course you can keep a secret. Now, there's an interesting point about this, that this has only very recently come to light. There's something called the keyhole satellites, which are spy satellites in effect. They've been up there for several years now. The current one is the KH-12, keyhole 12. And they're the ones that take the photographs. You know, you can read a newspaper headline from space and all that. They're the ones that do that. That's why you can read the car number plates from space. When the first space shuttle was launched, the Columbia, was launched in 1981, there was a very big fear that some of the heat shield tiles had been loosened on launch and wouldn't protect the craft on its return. Now, there were 4 astronauts on board at the time. There was a real problem. How would NASA find out if the space shuttle had been damaged on launch, which we know happened on the Challenger mission when a piece of ice fell off and hit the space shuttle? On the first launch, the inaugural launch in 1981, 9 years after Apollo had finished, they found that they could orbit the space shuttle at a certain altitude so that it could be photographed in space by the Hexagon spy satellite. If that could be maneuvered out of its polar orbit, which is what it was in, it would meet the space shuttle on one orbit, and it was able to get into position to photograph the space shuttle as it orbited 17,500 miles an hour. It could photograph it so that the photographs could then be transmitted back to Earth, and the scientists could have a look at the photographs to see if the space shuttle heat shield tiles had been damaged to the extent that it would endanger the shuttle on its re-entry. Very few people even knew this had happened, let alone the information. That's only come out in the last 2 to 3 years. So a great deal of secrecy surrounds NASA and surrounds their activities. So anybody who works for NASA who's listening to this, please do your duty and confront the Apollo legacy, because until you do, your function as a space scientist is severely limited.
The landing. Now, the moon's a very tranquil place. There's obviously no atmosphere, no gravity, or little gravity. I think there's a tad. But could the craft have landed on the surface? Is it capable of accepting something like that without any kind of major disaster?
It's highly unlikely. There is a small amount of gravity, as you say, on the moon, about 1/6 the amount of gravity we have here on Earth. So there is gravity there. Things do get pulled down onto the surface. When you're orbiting the moon, you're going to be orbiting at about 6,000 miles an hour. Mm-hmm. If you're going to land on the moon, you've got to come to a standstill. So the way you do that is you fire your rocket to slow you down. You retro-fire it. You fire it in the direction you're traveling. It will slow you down. You will then come, after a couple of orbits of slowing down, you will hover over the lunar surface with your rocket still firing, because it's got to counteract the small amount of gravity, and you will lower yourself onto the lunar surface. Two things here. If you're firing your rocket, it's going to be producing a certain amount of exhaust, which will disturb the lunar surface. And we know the lunar surface from the photographs is obviously very dusty and very lightly covered. It's not thick dust, it's quite secure, because they've already landed craft on the moon to discover that there wasn't 6 feet of dust into which you would sink. So they landed on the lunar surface. Very little dust is seen to be disturbed, which is the first anomaly. Because if you're looking at the photographs of the landers, the foot pads, which are relatively close to the exhaust, which is firing up until almost the moment that the thing hits the ground or touches the ground, you would expect the pads to show a little bit of dust having settled in them. It's a logical conclusion to reach. Any unmanned craft you see, the Surveyor craft on the moon and the Curiosity craft on Mars, shows dust on the craft after it's landed. So why isn't it on Apollo? That's another anomaly.
Okay.
All these things that just don't quite add up. And you start looking for other anomalies. In Apollo 11, only Armstrong had been trained to land the craft. Supposing he'd been incapacitated, Aldrin would have died as well, because the craft would have crashed. Why wasn't he trained? And also, there's no rescue possible either. They would have been dead.
Aldrin was named the LMP, Lunar Module Pilot, and couldn't fly it.
How many times have you flown in an aircraft? And if you were told that the co-pilot couldn't land the thing, would you even get on it?
Scott, the moon surface itself, let's discuss some of this with the photographs.
You're looking at a simulation entirely, so that's not the lunar surface you're looking at. That's a landfill site that they covered over. It's actually a scrap metal site that they have covered over. I believe that that's on the south side of Cinder Lake, just north of Flagstaff in Arizona. And that's why you see the cars, that's why you see the pieces of metal sticking up, that's why you see the rocket engines. I put a picture up of a nose cone of a missile that they propped up just to stage it. They put it right up on top of some rocks. They show you how they built the rocks and how they put the modeling clay, they sprayed the modeling clay on and then shot the dirt over top of it. That's what's in the photographs.
Did they ever set a camera up? Did they ever have film of the lunar module taking off?
Yes, they did. They missed it on 15. 16, the astronaut puts with the explosive bolts that separate the two descent and the ascent modules. You see the explosive bolts go off, and then there's no exhaust thrust, yet no visible exhaust at all. But on Apollo 16, the astronauts put a chunk of that explosive bolts in there and blew the whole side of the craft off. The 4 panels come off. If you watch it even at normal speed on the Apollo 16 liftoff, you see the panels come off. And then go take a look at the photo on Apollo 17. They replaced the 4 panels, but they're lighter color now. They're using the same piece of equipment over and over again. It's just as simple as that.
There's some photographs here that we're posting in chat for everybody to see. I'll try and describe these the best I can.
Sure.
With this, this one shows the lunar vehicle with the astronauts sitting in there, and then it has this close-up of a mound of rock or dirt, and then there it looks like a stick. It almost looks like an egg beater or a whisk on the end of it.
That's the grasping tongs, and the rover's sitting on 3 wheels. One's off the ground.
It's literally
And
floating.
what struck me about this picture, I mean, in Apollo 12, there's some gradual mounds of dirt. This pile of dirt looks like it was put on there by a front-end loader. And it really struck me because it's the only feature like that in all the thousands of photographs, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't understand exactly what it was, so I put this on my desktop. And when I was walking by my computer, I looked at the shadow of the grasping tongs, and it makes an arrow. And when you get down to the end of the arrow, there's an astronaut's glove buried in the dirt. And when you look at the rest of it, it's a whole pile of gloves. They're just covered over with dirt. You can see the 4 fingers sticking out.
You can see it
all over the place.
Oh my goodness.
It's completely staged, which means that the people that did the set were involved in it, and the astronauts were involved in it, and the photographers were involved in it.
You could see this, and one thing, correct me if I'm wrong.
I gave you a close-up of the glove at the end of the arrow, and once you see it, it might have only taken 30 years if they had used a neon sign. Like, that's about a 3-foot arrow shadow, and when you realize that they're pointing it out, I've got other pictures with the tongs where they're pointing out different things on the rock. The other rock that they made is just plastered over a wire cage. I showed a shot of the close-up of the wire cage through the hole, which is just down and below the right of the thing. That's the same everywhere. They use the NOAA, they use their feet, they point everywhere to stuff. Like, each astronaut, each mission has a slightly different style of how they show you the stuff. But they literally dig it up and show it to you. They wanted to document this, and it's the only thing they're doing with those cameras, and it's consistent for all 6 missions over 2.5 years. They didn't fade on their mission one bit.
Correct me if I'm wrong here. Marcus, if you want to take this with the lunar surface, and Scott described that this pile looked like it was dumped by a backhoe or front end loader.
But don't forget, the moon is, because it has no atmosphere, it is liable to be hit by any passing meteor that happens to want to get close to the moon. And when a meteor hits, it goes at very, very high speed. It will cause a great deal of destruction. If a large meteor lands, it's going to make a crater. There's a meteor crater in Arizona, which is quite a good example of what a meteor will do when it hits a planet. And all the rocks will just become dust, or dust-like, in the end. And so you get what it's called regolith, the lunar dust. When the rocket for the ascent stage fires, it's about 4,500 pounds of thrust. And we've all seen rockets being fired and taking off, and then normally the rocket will have a huge exhaust plume firing underneath the rocket.
Mm-hmm.
The ascent stage of the lunar lander, it was attached directly to the top of the descent stage, and there was nowhere for the exhaust gas to go. There was no hole in it, there was no channel for it, it was a completely flat surface. And so you've got this rocket firing. It's quite a powerful thing, a 4,500 pound thrust rocket. The astronauts are standing within 2 or 3 feet of that exhaust, and the thing has to build up a power before it can lift off. Or it's on the moon, the gravity is much less than it is on Earth, but we've seen the effort it takes to get a rocket up into the air. And the rocket engine will fire for a few seconds before it moves. It has to. Where did the exhaust gases go? These superheated 3,000 degrees centigrade exhaust gases. They would have fried the astronauts, completely destroyed the craft, and the thing would have just burnt in a beautiful, fiery Catherine wheel, because it would have just been somersaulting all over the place. It's a ridiculous idea to think that you can fire a rocket with nowhere for the exhaust gas to go and expect 2 astronauts, and one of them, I think it's on Apollo 16, says, "What a ride, what a ride." Like he's done it 100 times already, and it's just yet another simulation exercise, which is what I claim it is.
So tell us about the return and the details with that, Marcus.
Okay. When you come back from the moon, you've got to get out of lunar gravity, which is not very great. And as you get out of that, you head towards Earth. And as you approach Earth, you're gradually accelerating because of the gravity of the Earth attracting objects towards it. In order to make sure that you slow down, you have to enter the Earth's atmosphere at a very, very acute angle. It's actually 6.4 degrees to the Earth's surface. You will then travel through the Earth's atmosphere for about 1,000 miles, and the craft will become quite hot, and we saw the tragedy of the Columbia craft as it broke up in the Earth's atmosphere. That's what it would look like. It's interesting that nobody has ever photographed an Apollo craft returning through the Earth's atmosphere, glowing as hot as it will.
Is there any validity to that, or is it just like an urban legend that Stanley Kubrick actually directed all this and set it all up?
I would say it's an urban legend, because he released the film 2001: A Space Odyssey, if not the greatest science fiction film ever made. He was working on it quite extensively. Kubrick was a perfectionist, as we know. Whether he had any active role beyond maybe just consultancy, I don't know. There's no evidence that I've seen. There are people who will say that he did have something to do with it.
He watched every little detail of everything.
The film director who is more likely to have had a hand in this fantasy is the master of fantasy himself, Walt Disney, who was a personal friend of Werner von Braun. He was on site. He knew what he was doing to create fantasy, to make people believe something was happening when it was just a piece of celluloid. I think he is the more likely person who would have been consulted, and he certainly knew Werner von Braun. There were photographs of them together.
Oh,
whether
wow.
he did or not, I don't know. No.